Welcome to the Think Twice podcast. I'm Jacob Schreiner-Briggs.
And I'm Jordan Yule.
And before we get to today's guest, introducing today's guest, we do have a few housekeeping preamble items. So from me, I forgot to thank a friend of mine in the first episode who, when I was setting out to do this initially, had given me a lot of support, helped me with some of the basics, and instructed me and encouraged me to keep this going. So I don't think I'd be sitting here having this conversation with Jordan if it wasn't for Justin White. So shout out to you, Justin.
And we also want to thank and dedicate this episode to Jordan Wolf, who became our second Patreon subscriber at the Brainiac level, our first Brainiac. We want to say thank you, and again, this is dedicated to Jordan Wolf, and you could follow him on Twitter at JWDEM. If you want to be a Patreon subscriber and you would like to dedicate an episode to yourself or any cause or person, go to patreon.com/thinktwice.
Today's guest is Margarita Noriega. Margarita is a digital consultant and editor based out of Brooklyn. She's worked in both public policy in D.C. and newsrooms in New York, including Reuters, Vox, and Fusion. She studied international affairs at George Washington University and decided not to go to law school after falling in love with how we use social media to communicate political messages. Today we will be talking about social media and politics, pile-on culture, and the outrage machine. So with that, welcome Margarita Noriega.
Hey guys, how are you?
Doing well.
So, Margarita, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm trying to think about what comes next after the U.S. exited the Paris Agreement, but other than that, I'm doing fine. The Paris Agreement, had its critics along the way, and it took a long time to build. So my hope is that, maybe we might have to start from scratch again, but we'll see where it goes.
And the silver lining here is that Trump is going to have a better climate deal, right?
Yeah, of course. Everyone knows he's going to have a bigger, better, more American, greater climate deal. I think we shouldn't call it a Paris Accord or a climate change agreement. I think we should call it Make Great Business with Science Agreement.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, that way we can pull some, people who just really like business into the mix.
What we were really lacking in the previous climate deal was freedom. And now we have more freedom. So thank you. Thank God for Trump.
I can smell all the freedom.
So you're really here to talk about pile-on culture, the internet outrage machine. And this week we had another instance of the internet being outraged with Kathy Griffin. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and just to give you some context, I usually try not to pay too much attention to very short internet news cycles because I find that things are going faster and faster these days, and it's hard to, even for someone like me who I probably read a few dozen articles or news reports every day, it's hard for me to keep up. So the Kathy Griffin thing, though, which I'll kind of go through, I think really prompted something inside me I felt uncomfortable with. So what happened with Kathy was she worked with a photographer whose name is Tyler Shields, and Tyler himself is a reasonably controversial photographer. He's been accused of stealing art. He's been accused of stealing style from other artists, of not paying appropriate credits to artists that he might have been inspired by. So Tyler Shields himself is kind of a controversial figure in photography, but he does a lot of really high-end shoots that look great if you sort of don't count the criticism about where he's getting his inspiration from. So if you just look at his work, it's usually just very high quality photography, amazing stuff, and a lot of people like it. So you have an amazing photographer, controversial amazing photographer, and then you have a controversial arguably amazing comedian, depending on whether or not you think Kathy Griffin's funny, working together. And what happened was what I think the product of that collaboration caused an eruption of outrage, and the product of that collaboration was, and we actually don't know who inspired the imagery that came out of the photo shoot, but all the internet saw was a picture of Kathy Griffin holding a fake severed disembodied head, and the head is of Donald Trump. And so the head is covered in blood. It looks like Donald Trump's head, and comedian is holding the head, and she's a very serious look on her face, and we don't know if Tyler Shield pitched this to Kathy. We don't know if Kathy pitched this to Tyler. We have no idea what the artistic process was, but the internet became very upset at a very violent, aggressive photo. So once that kind of landed on Twitter and on the internet, a lot of people were very upset for a variety of reasons. And those reasons, they range from the appropriately upset, those who were upsetted by the violent nature of the photo or of the context of the photo, and then others who maybe don't think Kathy Griffin is very funny. So you had a lot of people saying, I didn't think you were funny in the first place, and now I think you're even less funny. So you kind of had people who just didn't like Kathy anyway. And then you had people who really liked Kathy who were just shocked that she was working with Tyler Shields because they don't like Tyler Shields. And finally, you had people who were offended by the photo because they think it's a very sensitive time, and people shouldn't be, maybe, everybody needs to come to the table and work together, and, maybe we should all, what is the saying, cooler heads will prevail? Well, this photo shoot was kind of the opposite of the cooler heads will prevail thing. So we have no idea what inspired this, but a lot of people are offended for a lot of different reasons, and it turned very quickly into a conversation about how Kathy is bad, and she should feel bad, and what she did was bad, and there was like this huge sudden response to the art as if Kathy owned the entire artistic process. It wasn't a selfie. I assume Kathy didn't make the fake head herself. I don't think she's a prop artist. So I assume there was a team of people working with her to sort of make this photo shoot. But it all became how Kathy was a bad person and she should feel bad, and it was super offensive. And it kind of, for me, looking at it, it spun completely out of control, because all of a sudden it went from a artistic collaboration of an arguably terrible art idea. And I personally was very offended by the image, only because I'm very sensitive to violent images as a reporter, former breaking news journalist. I have worked in newsrooms where I've had to look at violent graphic images for my job, and I don't really appreciate personally parody when it has to do with violence. However, from an artistic standpoint, I have no idea what the artistic process was. So while I was watching everyone sort of pile on to Kathy specifically without asking any questions about the art, the project, and I'll end here, but it raised some questions for me about how we consider Kathy in the context of what we think journalists should be doing, and whether or not we think, journalists and comedians are the same thing. And then finally, as some of your listeners may or may not know, CNN dropped Kathy from their end-of-year New Year's Eve program as a result of the photo shoot. So I'll stop there.
So I suppose then, injecting into this conversation the political element, one of the reactions I saw on Twitter, I think it was Chris Hayes, he pointed out that there's a difference between a controversy, which is something that people will generally disagree about, and something that people overall just think is bad. And I think the point that he was trying to make there was that, again, like almost everything else, this became a political issue almost instantly. And of course it was, because we're talking about a depiction of the severed head of the President of the United States. But in the less obvious way, some people immediately rushed to make it a political issue, in the sense of it being a partisan issue. That was to say that I think more left-leaning people came out and said, well, there's been prior treatment of President Obama specifically in this horrible way, and yet we don't see this massive outrage. And here, clearly, as you just laid out for everyone, there was this huge pile-on up until the point where CNN terminated her contract. So I don't know. obviously there's a lot of stuff going on implicated with this issue. So art, as you mentioned, and free speech. But if you wouldn't mind, maybe start with politics. I mean, what are your thoughts on, I guess, the politically charged nature of this whole event?
I think it's quite entertaining that Corey Lewandowski, who assaulted Michelle Fields while she was doing her job, while she was asking a question, or trying to ask a question, as a journalist to now President Donald Trump, then nominee Donald Trump, during a campaign stop, is a contributor to a network which just fired a comedian for participating in a terrible art project. Kathy Griffin didn't behead anyone, and Corey Lewandowski assaulted someone. And I have to really, to me, the politicization of the art is far more interesting to me than the subject itself, because it shows us what's going on right now with social media and the media, and how the media perceives art, and how normal everyday Americans perceive the role of non-journalists in journalistic discussions. I genuinely think that Kathy was not trying to be political. I think she was trying to be funny, because that's her job. She's not a, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of comedians who have gone into politics. We can go down the list of, the politicians who want to be funny, and the comedians who try to be political, and, but I don't know if Kathy was actually, I don't know what the message would have been, what the Kathy was really mad this morning, and that she decided to kill the president. I don't exactly know what the literal interpretation is, and I think the politicization was done by CNN. I don't think the politicization was done by Kathy. That's my take.
And I mean, talking about her job, she lost this part of her career. I mean, she's not completely out of work. And some people who are at the bottom of a pylon do lose their jobs. This happens to a lot of average people all the time, too. How do you feel about people, for instance, like Justine Sacco, a relative nobody, making a mistake, doing something arguably stupid, and then losing their job as a result of society being upset with their action?
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference between performative offense and actual and earnest offense. I guess I think for me, I give creative people a little bit more leeway to be performatively offensive, and I don't think Justine Sacco is being performatively offensive. I think she was being earnestly, perhaps subconsciously offensive, versus but the question is, of course, here's who I want to ask this question. I want to ask Tyler Shields, right? I want to ask Tyler Shields, who I think told TMZ yesterday or maybe today. They asked him if he could defend the art, and Kathy has apologized. I think within a few hours she had a video up on Twitter, and I think on Instagram too, where she earnestly apologized. She said it was a huge mistake, it was a bad project, and she was kind of ashamed of herself. And Tyler loves it, right? Like, Tyler told TMZ that he's, so I think Tyler is sort of the Justine Sacco in this case, because he's quite earnestly defending himself, and but that's sort of one thing. So I think there is a difference between being creatively, performatively offensive versus being earnestly offensive. But the second thing I'll say is, and one that, one person, Kathy apologized versus Tyler who didn't apologize. So I think those things matter, but the pylon is such a waste of time. I mean, so I'm looking, actually, I looked around to see what people were saying about Kathy, and it's interesting. So Best Coast, the band Best Coast, tweeted, it's Thursday now, they tweeted a few hours ago, so late in the day on Thursday of this week. It's a Photoshop from TMZ, and it's Donald Trump it's Donald Trump's face where Kathy Griffin's face is on her body in the same photo photoshopped over her face. So it looks like Donald Trump with like a wig on. And instead of his head being held up, it's a red globe. And I assume it's an allusion to his disenchantment and exit from the Paris Agreement. And I think we're wasting our time by being outraged by individual mistakes and individual people when there are actually big issues going on in the world, like us exiting the Paris Accord or Brexit, or recent reports regarding foreign adversaries who have an interest in misaligning our democratic processes during elections. Those are the actual things. And my issue with the outrage cycle is that it's wasting time. It's just wasting time.
So there's also, and we have to talk about this, the free speech question. So when we talk about something that's offensive, whether artistic or earnest, prior to the advent of social media, if you did something that was offensive, whoever was in the immediate vicinity of that comment or action could choose, at that point to disassociate or to cease being your friend or to maybe respond. But there wasn't this mechanism of amplification like we see in social media. So we Jordan and I have a mutual friend, James, and in his opinion is that if it's free speech and it's not done on company time, essentially, that there shouldn't be these sort of professional repercussions like we see across the political spectrum. So it's not just conservatives or liberals, it's everyone. If there's something that's done that is offensive to a large swath of people, and then we have this amplification over social media, then it tends to lead to things like this, like to Kathy Griffin being fired. But his approach was that if this is off the clock, it doesn't have anything to do with your employer, and if it's within the bounds of free speech, that it shouldn't affect your professional prospects. So I guess I'd be interested in getting your take on that, and also on a secondary question, which is, do you think there's any inherent logic or coherence to what the internet chooses to be especially offended by? So not to diminish offense at any turn, but like you mentioned, there are seemingly some things that should be garnering responses like what we saw to Kathy Griffin, which just aren't on both sides of the on all sides of the political spectrum. So I don't know. I'd just like to get your thoughts on those issues.
Yeah, there's an increasing mob effect, I think, on social media. I think, and it's related to a couple of things. I think one, there are more people using social media than ever. Social media is generalizing popularity. It has a generalized popularity in a way it didn't have 5 years ago. So, if you remember, nobody knew what Snapchat was 2 years ago, really, or 3, even though Snapchat was around. So Twitter, took 3, 4, 5 years to finally break through to more general audiences, perhaps people who aren't everyday users. So when we have more people who are willing to join mobs, it's just a numbers game, versus say 10 or 20 years ago on the internet. So these things usually, this mob kind of culture usually was held or contained in social networks that wouldn't cross over to one another. So I'll give you an example. So 4chan, right? So you could kind of say like outrageous things or also, inspire or lead a mob mentality, an internet mob against someone on, a group chat, right? Or a group of some kind where you're really going into someone, maybe you hate, a local TV anchor, or you hate a reporter for the Washington Post or whoever it is, you just don't like them. And, maybe they offended you in some way for better or for worse. So you would have those things, but those comments kind of lived on 4chan, or they lived on Reddit, or maybe they lived on the comments page of that article, right? That was moderated on the WashingtonPost.com. And so these conversations, these mini mobs usually didn't really have the capacity to rally the troops across networks. And now if somebody does something offensive, right, it has a network effect, and it goes everywhere. So Kathy Griffin was, of course, she was trending on Facebook today. She was all over Google News. TV picks it up, and then once TV picks it up and networks start talking about it, then the rest of the internet starts talking about it because everyone's picking up clips, right, from the TV reporters who are reporting it. So all of a sudden it's on thousands of websites within 24 hours that Kathy Griffin did a stupid art project, and she's really sorry about it, but nobody cares because, I don't know, like we all hate her now or something. So there's a network effect that just didn't exist on the internet before, and I would say that that's really about the technology and the way social media is being used, and also the way it connects more closely to other networks than it ever did before. And so that's just really technology and trends, and has really nothing to do with, you know, a rise in public interest in creating mobs. But the other part of it, which was more to your second question, is that I think there's something changing. There seems to be a shift in the way people talk about politics. We know from research that Americans are becoming more polarized, both in the news that they read and in what they believe about how other people think about the world. Like a Republican voter, say, or a Republican Party member probably knows far less about what Democrats believe than they did 20 years ago, and the same is vice versa. There are Democrats who know far less about what Republicans think, right? So we're getting more polarized, which means that mobs are more likely to occur politically. And so you have, okay, this technology that's being built for rage politics, and then you have rage politics which then influence how we use social media, and they're just building and building and building and building and building. And it's hard for me to blame any individual person for becoming offended or outraged on the internet, because I want to believe that people are genuinely outraged. You know, I don't want to gaslight anyone and say, hey, you aren't really offended by this. Like, you know, I think there are a lot of people who are genuinely offended by the photo shoot, right? They thought it was inappropriate and shameful that Kathy participated in it, right? And I believe them. But I don't know what the consequences are, and I think what happens with mobs is that they lead to things like people getting fired. And I don't know. I don't know if anyone should lose their jobs. I think there are some people who probably should lose their jobs. I mean, personally, I think, you know, if you incite violence, you know, if you go on Twitter and say, I think we should kill somebody, maybe you should lose your job. Like, maybe if you're breaking the law, you know? Mm-hmm. But if it's within a protected form of speech, I'm not sure it's appropriate. What I will say is that I'm currently, you know, I'm calling in from New York, and New York is a state, it's one of the few states where you can be, an employer can terminate someone without cause. And so I think people should be aware of the law. There are a lot of employers who, they don't need to have cause to terminate your position or to terminate you. And, you know, the law is kind of, it's you know, being offensive and keeping your job has never been a safe bet anyway, right?
Yeah, I think, well, to your point about the internet enabling these types of mobs, I totally agree. And I think I'm looking at it from a different angle. I think because we have this type of technology and we spend so much time on it and roasting people and and I'm totally guilty of this. Like, I kind of made a habit out of just talking back to Trump and like mocking Tommy Loren. And I think when people do that to average people, and especially when they see someone that they admire or someone that they know doing it, it's okay. And ultimately we're devaluing the person on the other end. Like we're dehumanizing them. And I think we see this with a lot of these types of pile-ons. It just, they see everyone doing it. It's fodder for jokes. They might get some retweets out of it. They try to put out their best work. But at the other end, like, there is someone on a phone or on their computer on the other end, like, actually seeing this and feeling real tangible effects as a result of this. And that's frightening at the direction we're heading. And
it's easy to pile on too. So
so easy.
I think political polarization might become a theme of these podcasts, because seemingly almost everything goes back to it. But when we talk about de-individuation and mob mentality on the internet, if you're a Democrat and you view a Republican as the enemy, not as a person, but as the enemy, or vice versa, and if we're on the internet and you can de-individuate more easily there, you don't need to be as accountable necessarily for piling on, and that coupled with the fact that, politics are no longer about these reasonable disagreements on important issues, but rather about winning the nearest fight, it seems to be the case that's really going to facilitate that piling on that you talked about, because it's almost what you're expected to do. It's what you should be doing. You should be going after the quote-unquote enemy. So when conservatives have a chance to pile on about an art project, they're going to do it, and vice versa. And so I don't know how you reverse that trend, but I do think it comes back to polarization, and I think it leads to the erosion of discourse, because you're not actually having nuanced conversations about anything. You're just jumping on to the herd. So, Kathy did something horrible, and that's what everyone thinks, and that's what everyone's saying. So I'm going to say that too, up until the point she loses her job at CNN, because I don't think that they could handle the negative PR that they, that they probably would have faced had they kept her on.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, CNN was in their legal right to end that agreement. Or actually, I actually don't know that, because I don't know the terms of the agreement, but I assume they are, because they know how to write contracts. But we'll see, I guess, if Kathy disagrees. But even if you're dealing with business as business, it's strange to me that all of a sudden we're supposed to, I don't know, it feels like a weird social condemnation that's like in a very permanent sense. And actually, the one person I think who has spoken a lot about this sense of public condemnation to the point of ruining her own career is Monica Lewinsky. She's spoken extensively about how some of her mistakes and some of her experiences in life, and especially those specifically related to former President Bill Clinton and her relationship with Clinton, damaged her self-confidence, damaged her career, damaged her opportunities. And she was quite well educated and is a very smart person, and she's written extensively about having a relationship that society sort of condemns can lead a lot of people to depression, and it becomes not only a mental health issue but a physical health issue. It's really dangerous. I'm afraid to say that I don't personally think it's going to get any better, which is why I tend not to. I think the best thing any individual can do is not to participate in pile-ons unless they're absolutely certain that they're willing to consider the consequences on the other side. But I think it's better just not to participate at all. It's really sad that social media has just become this huge mob. I feel like it's just a huge mob, and it's becoming more and more so every day. And also, there are legitimately, there are things that are happening that we should be outraged about, that are actually getting lost in the mix of things that maybe have, limited consequences, which is frustrating as someone who cares about, progressivism and politics and journalism. There are things that people should be reading instead, I think.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're getting at then is triaging our outrage. So if we kind of fly off the handle and go out into the streets, for lack of a better phrase, with torches and pitchforks about everything, everything worth being upset about tends to seem the same. And it...
Yes, we're devaluing, that's exactly it. I think we are devaluing things that are more important by becoming upset about everything. And it's really, it means we're going to miss the things that we really should care about, I think.
What is your feeling about the sort of opportunism? So again, it's a green light. It's a green light if something happens that puts the quote unquote enemy in a bad light. So again, conservatives had a green light. This was obviously a green light to attack someone who was doing something that was, in some ways suggesting, well, not in some ways, was clearly suggesting, even if artistically, violence against a Republican president. So then Republicans have the green light, or conservatives have the green light to come out especially. And I think this might not be the best example of that particular phenomenon, because again, I think the condemnation was pretty universal. I don't think that there were many Democrats out there trying to justify the art. I think, though, it still became politicized in the sense that a lot of left-leaning people just turned to counter examples of it working the other way. But I don't know. How do you... Maybe what do you think about it? But also, is there a solution? Or do you think, again, the solution is to just refrain from participating in these sort of giant back and forth and exchange of opportunities to really go after the other party for being offensive or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that people will, become so exhausted by faux outrage news cycles that they'll kind of go away. Like maybe it's just like a meme, like my ideal version of the way this ends is that maybe in 5 or 6 months, everyone in America is exhausted by fake, not just fake news, but fake outrage. And maybe, it's just like a time in our... So I'll give a good example of what I'm kind of fantasizing about. So do you remember in any cartoon that we grew up with, and certainly people who are older than us, like Gen Xers grew up with, there was always like any cartoon or any mystery show, any action show, there's always like a scene with quicksand where like someone was going to die because, right, so my ideal is that, and we learn later, of course, that like quicksand like rarely kills anybody. Like, I'm hoping that like this outrage thing will be kind of the 2010s scene, where maybe in 15 years we'll joke about like how weird it was that we cared so much about like, these trends, that somebody did something offensive for an hour and all of a sudden, we talk about it for 3 days on the internet. I'm hoping it'll be like quicksand, right? We'll just laugh about it. But right now it feels very dangerous because there is just there's so much at stake right now. We have tax reform, we have health care reform, we have immigration reform, we have climate change policy reform, we don't even know what the federal budget is going to be for this coming year. We have a variety of races coming up in 2017 and 2018. So just from a pure sort of news and political standpoint, the last thing I think anyone should be caring about, if they actually care about the news or want to be an informed consumer of the news, is these sort of like mini trending, like hot trending things. And the only way to fight back against that, I think, is just not to feed into them, not to participate in them, but also maybe to be okay with walking away from reading that hot trend story that everyone's sharing. And I hate to say that as someone who, I love social media. I love reading. I'm a huge proponent of the open web and net neutrality. I think the internet has done more good than it has done bad. But we got to stop. We got to stop participating. I think, and that means just not only radio silence, but also not, just don't click on that trendy thing.
Exercise self-restraint.
Yeah, if possible. I'm kind of like smiling on the other end of this because I know how impossible and silly it sounds. It sounds completely naive. I appreciate that. I don't know. Like, what do you guys think? Is there anything we can possibly do to stop this train, this like outrage train?
Well, it's got to start somewhere. And so for me, I think it starts with things like this, which bring a little bit more nuance into any conversation. I mean, even if I was sitting here and completely disagreed with you or completely disagreed with Jordan, a forum like this allows us to sort of hash those out. And we don't necessarily need to leave agreeing, but at least we allow for a free exchange of ideas and find points where we share ground and then find points where we very genuinely disagree. But at that point, though, we've humanized each other and we've just been two people who disagree who have had a discussion about our disagreements, as opposed to this giant wave of opportunistic outrage that seems to really predominate social media. So I don't know. I mean, you say it sounds unrealistic, and I suppose in my ears it does as well, just knowing how easy it is to give in, and to hop on the train and to be outraged and to send volleys against your political opponents. But I do think that if more and more people make a commitment, even if it's small, to having discussions as opposed to arguments or hurling insults or demanding for someone's resignation over something that in the grand scheme of things isn't as consequential as the outrage might make it seem, that's going to be progress. It's one step at a time. But I think there's a lot of validity and importance to what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, even just talking about it, like, I do know, I have quite a few acquaintances who work at CNN, and if one of them pulled me aside, over dinner or maybe like a coffee tomorrow and said, hey, look, like, we were just personally offended by, that art. And even though we realized it was, in Kathy's right to make it because she's not an employee here and we didn't approve the project, we just felt uncomfortable with, the culture in which she made the art. And we didn't think, that's a completely fair thing. I don't. The weird thing is that I think the more people talk to each other, the closer they get to being reasonable and fair and understanding each other. And it almost feels like the opposite way on the internet, right? It almost feels like the more you talk to strangers on the internet, sometimes the more it feels like you're on opposite ends, like, and I see this a lot, like in comment sections and or tweet chains where people start yelling at each other, calling each other names, or there's a lot of like ad hominems, going on, and just it doesn't feel the same, and I would say that's a technology problem. That's not a human problem. That is the social networks. They are, and a lot of people have said this, but it's sad for me to say, but I think there's something to, Twitter has been criticized many times for years for not like honing in the harassment, the levels of harassment on the platform. And maybe we're like in the middle, the fact that like Twitter is also, it's like the headquarters for breaking news on the internet, and then Twitter's also becoming this like increasingly open space for harassment. Maybe like this is sort of fueling the outrageness, like maybe I never really thought of it this way, but maybe if Twitter actually approached harassment in a different way or was more stringent about it, maybe people would be less willing to go in the way like I see people go in on like Reddit or 4chan.
I suppose for people to buy in, to stress the difference between preventing harassment and making sure that people understand that this isn't censorship, it's an encouragement of actual discussion. And then when we get into harassment too, I mean, we're talking about things that in a lot of cases probably aren't legal, because we're always, when we talk about any sort of dialogue, you continually bump into protected versus unprotected speech, which of course is a crucial consideration. But I think if we flip the script and we stop saying, okay, look, you can't say this, you can't say that, and instead take the approach that, well, you should be saying it this way, or if you want to generate an actual discussion, it's better to approach a person in this certain way without coming down and being punitive about it, because the one thing that's never going to get anyone to change the way they approach expressing themselves is to tell them that they can't do it that way, but instead inviting people into a more open and nuanced form of dialogue. And I think another problem that you bump into with social media is that it becomes so easy to dehumanize the person on the other end of the screen that I think if you put these people who are just insulting each other in the nastiest of ways into a room together, you would not see anywhere near that level of animus and hate and just counterproductive sessions of name calling. I don't think that you'd see that, because I think when you understand that the other person is a human, even if they disagree with you on every issue under the sun, that's going to calibrate the way that you approach a conversation in a way that's more productive. And maybe this is just me waxing philosophical, but I think that when discourse breaks down, that strongly undermines civil society. I mean, I think it is absolutely incumbent on people who live in a democratic society that we talk with one another, not necessarily for the sake of consensus building, because I think there are issues that people are always going to disagree on, and I think there are right and wrong answers, but nonetheless, it is important for me to listen to the opposing view as opposed to just shutting them out and dehumanizing them and creating these echo chambers, because I think, as this conversation has shown all of us, none of us like where those echo chambers leave, and I don't think any of us think that they're particularly useful or productive.
Do you think there's anything to say about, like, I think a lot about how, like, when I see, like, polls about what millennials are like and, you know, the kind of cultural values we have, and of course I'm using a very wide brush. I'm using anybody that's kind of born in the 80s, you know, as, like, my general kind of millennial thing. But I wonder, like, it always seems to me interesting that, like, I read a lot of these, like, these surveys and these studies about how millennials value collaboration, and they value, you know, like, difference of opinion, and they value, and then I go online to these, like, very millennially, you know, platforms, and it just feels like millennials are just yelling at each other and calling each other names all the time, and, like, I think about that. I wonder if, like, we're as, like, you know, rosy and collaborative as, like, these marketing studies about millennials, you know, purport that we are.
Yeah, and I think everything gets kind of tribal. So the more that we talk about, you know, the fact that we're millennials and we're not Gen Xers and we're not boomers, the more we create ourselves and perceive ourselves to be a monolith that is opposed in some fundamental ways to other monoliths. And I think that logic applies across the board, whether we're talking differences of race or religion or politics or even generation. That sort of mentality where, well, we're in this group and you're not, it's paradoxical that when we focus so much on being quote unquote millennials, and that we categorize ourselves as being invested in enjoying collaboration, I mean, I think by focusing on that label, you inherently undercut in some ways collaboration, because you've focused more on the in-group, out-group than you have on, I guess, the individual within that group and their ability to transcend group and to have meaningful interactions with people outside of that group. Because if we say millennials, for instance, are specifically geared towards collaborating, then I think there's an insinuation that other generations aren't. And obviously, I'm sure sociology and the social sciences can actually observe these things and make some legitimate empirical claims about them. But I think generally as a practice, that's more counterproductive to the intermingling of individuals within groups than it facilitates. And then, of course, the internet is just the perfect demonstration of how that can absolutely just not be the case, that millennials also just love screaming at each other behind keyboards. So
Right. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, speaking of, like, outrage culture, like, I feel like that there's, like, in very, very right circles, there's this, in conservative circles, there's this conversation about how safe spaces are actually limiting free speech. And I feel like, you know, because people who are currently in college are, you know, they're a little bit, they're younger, they're years younger than, you know, anyone who's born in the 80s, certainly. I wonder if there's any crossover in your mind between what's going on in campuses right now with, you know, say, like, you know, Ann Coulter going to Berkeley, right, and sort of being shut out and protested, and someone like Kathy Griffith being protested and by people who are offended by what she's saying, even though technically both people are saying, you know, things that are arguably within their legal right to say under our speech freedom.
I can't stand that college students and college groups are so aggressively trying to control and limit the types of speakers and the ideas on campus. I mean, I haven't been out of college that long, but that idea was so reprehensible to me when I was in college, and it just seems like this has become the norm now. Or maybe this could be a product of sensationalized media, but this is just an awful approach to an idea you don't agree with on a campus where intellectual exploration is encouraged and celebrated. It just seems so antithetical to the ideas of higher education to me. It's very confusing, and I'm a little disappointed that this has become such a popular tactic.
there are some ideas that I find absolutely abhorrent, and some people that hold them that I find even more abhorrent. But I remember when the riots happened, I don't know if it was in response to Ann Coulter or
It was Milo.
Milo, yeah. And so Milo to be an absolutely disgusting person, and I find most of his views to be disgusting and ill-supported, and it seems to be the case that those feelings have since been validated in some ways anyway, but I wouldn't ever opine to shut him down because of those feelings. I mean, I think that the response to viewpoints, and depending on how you characterize it, I think when we say viewpoints with which we disagree, we're being a little relative about it, and that sort of relativity is good sometimes and not good sometimes. And then, because I think sometimes you can hold the view that views are just wrong and be correct in that. But regardless of the, I guess, degree to which we disagree, the response has to be more expression. So sure, protest the rally, or protest the speaker, and voice very clearly why those views are so abhorrent. But to resort to just shutting speakers down, or even worse, violence and destruction, I don't think that helps anybody, especially if we're talking about ideas. I mean, if we're saying we disagree so strongly with this person's idea and them communicating it, no action, they're not taking any action, they're just speaking, they're communicating an idea. If the response to that is going to be physical violence and destruction, I mean, that's not helping anyone. Even if I totally disagree with you, or agree with you that someone like Ann Coulter or Milo are just abhorrent people, and I do. I don't think violence is ever acceptable, even if we want to code it with a sort of progressive veneer. And I don't think it's productive. If the end goal is to show why your view is superior and why their view is abhorrent, I don't think you're going to convince anybody by shutting down speakers or engaging in violence or whatever.
Oh, and that's if you remember the Whitney versus California case, the member of the Communist Party, and at the turn of the 20th century, he ultimately won that case, but the Brandeis concurrence in that case relied on that type of thinking, that in our country, because we have such great free speech protections, the answer isn't to shut down your opponent completely. It's not to silence them. It's the best speech rises to the top, so you should respond with more speech. And in the context of these campus protests, that's exactly what Milo and Ann Coulter want. They thrive on that kind of stuff. It gives them more publicity, and it continues this narrative of the triggered crybaby libs. Like, how do people not see this? Like, stop doing that. Just let them go up, ignore them, and maybe they'll go away eventually. Just don't. They're doing this to antagonize you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I keep thinking about, like, how on the internet there's a way to say that you like something. There's a way to say that you don't like something. But there's no way to ignore somebody that might be offending you without just being silent. And I wonder if, like, people feel that they have to engage because there's no other way of showing that they don't care, that it's not that important to you. Like, I think a lot of people, like, especially on Twitter, like, they feel like they almost have to participate because everybody else is participating. And it's like so much, like you said, like, it's so much easier to tweet that you like, I think a lot about, like, people who tweet particularly horrible things, like there's this phrase that's very popular on Twitter, that's just, I think it's just like, die bitch. I think that's just the phrase. Like, I'm sure there are, like, literally tens of thousands of tweets that just say die bitch, and it's this very teen-centered way of saying I don't like you. It doesn't, it's not actually a death threat, but it's a very pointed way of saying I don't like you, or I don't like what you just said. And if somebody actually told me to my face, like, die bitch, I would be horrified. I'd feel, like, physically threatened, in a way that I don't feel I'm threatened on the internet. And, there is this problem we have with the way we use social media now, which is, there's no way to say, I think you're offensive and I disagree with you, but I don't, I'm not threatening you in any way.
Yeah, and I think that's further proof that although really fun and useful as a curator of information and news, Twitter is really a bad format for productive conversations. I think it's good for news. I think it's good for I've seen some great threads on Twitter that have taught me a lot. But when we're talking about the sort of conversations that I think all three of us are hoping people choose to partake in more frequently than these sort of rage-filled outbursts, Twitter isn't exactly the perfect vehicle. It's so much more conducive to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. And so maybe at that point then it becomes a choice not just to not participate in the outrage machine, but to also take your viewpoints to forums, to sounding boards, whatever media it is, and speak there, forums and media where it's more conducive to having a legitimate, substantive interaction with another person.
It's funny because as you're talking about substantive in-person conversations and forums, the President of the United States just tweeted 6 minutes ago, all caps, "Make America Great Again."
Oh, he makes a good point.
Let me think on that one.
Yeah. God, how did we elect a toddler?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember which writer called him America's troller in chief. He's like the original internet troll. Like we elected, who was it that said we elected an internet troll? Was it Dave Chappelle in the special? I think it might have been. But many people have made this reference that he acts like an outrager. Maybe, I don't know. Can any American not participate in outrage politics if our president is participating in outrage politics?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it fuels his base. I have no doubt about that. It really fires people up. But yeah, there's a perfect example. I mean, I have nothing to say to that because there's nothing I can say to it. It's in caps and.
Why don't we tweet to him like we have nothing to say to this at this time? We'll just very reasonably.
Yeah, I'll let him know that I'd appreciate if we could have a more nuanced conversation about this.
Maybe he'll come on the pod.
We can get him on.
Yeah,
hopefully.
I mean, maybe the way to solve this is to create an army of tens of thousands of nuanced bots on Twitter that reply to everything and say, "I'd like to have a more nuanced discussion."
Yeah, we'll astroturf people with thoughtful responses.
Yes, let's do it. I'm game.
It's a fantastic idea.
Well, yeah,
I think it's speaking,
for myself, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and very much appreciated your time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks.
If you like what you've heard today and want to support the podcast, follow us on Twitter at ThinkTwicePod and like us on Facebook at ThinkTwice.
And check out our website, thinktwicepodcast.com. And we could absolutely use your support. Please visit patreon.com/thinktwice to view subscription options. For as little as $5 a month, you can support our work. $5. That's 1 cup of coffee a month. Thank you.